We're going to continue on this discussion of land use and community planning by bringing Tom Kova up from University of Utah, so some of our far traveling speakers for this program. And he is a professor of geography, is going to talk about the public safety and the wildland-urban interface. And I believe his research is really on this kind of wildfire evacuation and some of these very practical elements associated with these emergencies. So welcome, Tom.
You're going to talk.
In the thing.
And you're going to press the button.
Yep.
And I'm going to give you a 5-minute warning and a 0, and you'll still have time for questions.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Thanks to Dave for all his help in getting here. Closer?
Yeah.
How's that? Better? Maybe I should just hold this thing. Is that better? Okay, there we go. I don't use a microphone much. Okay, so when I say public safety, mainly I mean life safety. I don't know very much about ecology, if anything. I don't know much about buildings except to the degree that they might offer shelter. So I mostly study getting people out of harm's way, as we heard about yesterday. Oakland, circa 1995. This is the neighborhood where all the problems occurred. And this, this picture, I still like it because it offers a chance to look at the roads. This was a closed, urban forest canopy before the fire. And here you can see the rebuilding in progress. This is the 4th anniversary. And, at this time when I started studying these kinds of neighborhoods, there really wasn't very many other people doing that. Civil engineers wouldn't, or traffic engineers wouldn't know what to even think of this. There's no equations for roads that bulge and 5 roads that meet at an awkward intersection on a steep slope. And, they were busy with freeways and traffic jams and free-flowing arterials like we have around here. Planners, this isn't exactly a planned community. They would call this incremental planning, I guess. I'm not a planner, but it's not Irvine, right? This is not a planned community. It's kind of an accident. I guess Dave told me to bring my points, and my first point is we build some scary neighborhoods. And I mean, not just build, but we are still building and have built, and and I mean scary in terms of trying to get everyone out. There's no backup plan for this community. There's no safety zone, all the things that wildland firefighters look for, what is it? Lookout, the term, LCES. There's no safety zone, there's no backup shelter. You only really have one option, which is get everyone out, so early warning. One of the questions I had when I started looking at these things was how many are there and where are they and how do we compare them? And this was some work I did with Rick Church at UCSB. Again, I'll give the black box approach that everyone else has given to their methods, but it reveals clusters in the network of communities that don't have a lot of connection with the outside world road-wise, but do have a lot of houses. So you can see down in the lower left, that's Isla Vista, no exits to the south, the east, to the west, only to the north, 17,000 students maybe. So a tricky evacuation, but not a really high wildfire area. That one over on the left with the long tail, that's Winchester Canyon, one of the one-way in, one-way out communities. At this point, I was using people per lane, but I switched later to households per exit because there's almost always just one lane per exit. And really households is an easier unit to study than people. The one that got everybody's attention was this one, Mission Canyon, now a pretty famous canyon, because it was in a high fire area. So what's going on? I think a lot of people here know the story, but look at those roads in 1928. Nobody in 1928 could have known that how those roads would be used in 1990. It's just dirt roads. I don't know what they were doing, walking cattle. There were some orchards. And then as we've seen in a couple other talks, the wholesale transformation of the vegetation, that was grass. And then you can see 1943 during World War II, a couple people had added their homes, a few more roads, but essentially the roads were laid out in 1943. This is before they were even paved. Then you got 1959 and then 1990. What do you call that? Wood homes, pepper trees, eucalyptus. So I did this in 1995. Fast forward, oh, sorry, one more slide. So to give you a clear idea of why this popped up in our search, 6 homes and 2 exits in 1938, 420 plus and 2 exits in 1990. So, and some of those homes up at the top there, Spyglass Road, that is the San Ynez Mountains, way up there. They've got a long journey to get out. So fast forward 14 years, and here comes the Jesucita fire from 3 different directions in 1 week. So the Gap fire threatened this neighborhood, and the T fire threatened this neighborhood, but neither of them got in there like the Jesucita fire did. Coming at it from the west, coming at it from the east and the north, didn't come at it from the south. I guess that was the one direction the fire. This happened over a week. So you get traffic deadlocked, evacuations confirmed, fire forces more to leave homes, full-on freak-out mode. So, you know, this is not too hard to predict. You can look at the neighborhoods and you can say someday that neighborhood's going to be a problem. The vegetation keeps growing, the homes keep getting added, the roads are scary. But the wildland-urban interface is large. This is from Wisconsin and it is dated. But we wanted to do the same thing for 11 Western states. And I've always had this question at the time, you know, which neighborhood out there of all the one-way in, one-way out neighborhoods has the record for the most housing units? Is it more than 1,000? Has anyone built one with more than 1,000 homes? And so we looked at the 11 Western states, millions of street segments, millions of intersections, a fire map that spans 11 states. This was one of our first discoveries, the Leisure World Golf Course on I-5. Never heard of it, but look at that nested lollipop nightmare in the middle there. And the fact that it has almost no connections to the golf course, to the road to the north, Ridge Route, you know, it's crazy. No fire risk. So something went wrong with our search. You could have a hazmat spill on this road, and that would be a complete circus in there trying to get everybody out. But fortunately, it was really a false alarm on our search. So we upped the fire threshold, and we thought we really need to look for high fire neighborhoods way up there at the top of the fire hazard. The next one we got was something like this. This is the Wilderness on I-70 in Colorado. Okay, fire risk. One way out, 748 homes. What is that, like 1,500 vehicles? That would be at only 2 vehicles per home. So, you know, probably more like somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 vehicles. One connection to get out. So here's our final list, and I highlighted the highest one we found was 806 homes with 1 exit in a fire area. And you can see SoCal is the winner of the death trap list here. Colorado, actually Northern California didn't even make the top 10 for the 1 exit communities. For the 2 exit communities, there were some interesting ones around here. And then there's a couple in Washington, but very much a Southern California and Front Range feature for some reason. And again, this is 2010 census data. So with the boom in the building in the last 7 years, you know, if somebody out there is going to break the 1,000 mark and get that trophy. Here's, you know, this is something that I think surprises people. It's just how many evacuations we might have in a given season, fire season. I'm still clinging to that antiquated concept. And this was 2012, 124, and we stopped counting in early November. One of these was the Waldo Canyon fire, which was 30,000 people in Colorado Springs. Some of them are really small. They might just be, you know, a couple hundred homes, but there were ones that were really big too. But I have a alert on my phone or from Google, you know, send me any article with wildfire evacuation in the article. And every day I get a digest. And in the middle of the summer, I'll get 20 or 30 articles a day of all the different evacuation hotspots out there. So I guess my point here, my second point is we do have a lot of evacuations that go really well, really smoothly. You know, it's kind of amazing. I scroll through them and it'll say, you know, they sent out the alert, people mobilized, they moved out, firefighters came in, all's well. You know, maybe some structures lost, which in my book is not that bad. I know there's other people that get, that's their area, but lots and lots of these things go pretty well. Thousands of them actually over the years. But we do tend to study the ones where things go wrong for lessons learned. This is another sort of leap here to move away from these new neighborhoods and to think about time. This is kind of a textbook breakdown of evacuation time phases for any disaster. You're going to have some incident detection time for wildfires. That's usually short because of the smoke and the flames. And we have cell phones these days to call 911, except at night, where that can be prolonged, right? Especially for a given household. Decision time is the time it takes officials, once they know about the fire, to make a call on on warning people. And you know, depending on how much time they have, they can wait a while if they feel like they have the luxury, or they can make this instantaneous and start sending out warnings. Warning time is the time it takes to warn people, and that's been greatly shortened by technology. From, say, the Oakland fire situation when we didn't have cell phones. The preparation time is the one that we try to get households to reduce by, you know, get your kit together by, you know, papers, pills, pets and all that, to save time in getting out. And then network clearing time is the one I showed you with Oakland, where, you know, how do you get out of there? So how long is that going to take? And altogether that makes up evacuation time. So, but we can have problems in any one of these phases. So we can have problems detecting things, as I mentioned. With wildfire, it's less common. But for, say, radiological releases or something, that's the big problem, is detecting it. Decision time, of course, we can have problems in terms of, you know, who should go, when should they go at all. Notification is less of an issue these days, especially if you have your cell network working. Preparation time can be prolonged. And also mobility can be an issue, right? So, you know, low mobility communities, special facilities, daycares, hospitals, medical facilities, all kinds of vulnerable populations. Here's a good situation where the fire hit the community after all this took place. And then here's the nightmare where the fire came into the community before the traffic was out. When I was in Los Alamos after the 2000 Cerro Grande Fire, I got super excited. They had the best evacuation plan I've ever seen in the world. And I thought, okay, there is stuff we can do. So we can put intersections in a state of uninterrupted flow. Never thought of that. You know, after sporting events, we do that. They did that. Phase one, we can stage the evacuation. These people are greatest at risk. You can see where the fire is coming from. So at 3 p.m., they sent the downtown area. At 3:30, the west end. At 4 that time, and then at 3 there. And then a fourth stage where they actually had this, they had a week to prepare this. They actually had regraded a dirt road for that last neighborhood to get out. So they got the whole town out. So I guess the lesson you get from this is it's good to have a nuclear lab near you if you're going to have a fire. Because nobody in the WUI gets a plan like this, right? This is because it's the federal government is there. So, but we can learn from this a lot of things. So I got fascinated with intersection conflicts. Here's a typical intersection with 16 collision points and 4 merges. You can block the entrances, which is common in evacuations, and that really reduces things. You can start putting out cones or blocking merges, and you can eventually get, which they had in Los Alamos, like this one, where, you know, everyone keep on moving. For, I don't know, maybe 10 years, I was Johnny Appleseed of the intersection thing. Still a lot of research going on this, but traveling around giving talks. I gave one talk in Colorado Springs in 2006. 6 years later, the Waldo Canyon fire hit, and this is pretty impressive. This is their evacuating mountain shadows here. And notice there's 3 lanes of traffic, so they're draining a huge region with this traffic. And then notice they reversed a couple lanes on the other side of the street, so they've got actually 5 lanes out. And you can see all the manpower it takes down here with the traffic direction. They left 1 lane open to get emergency vehicles up, but they sent me a thank you letter for this. They said that after I visited, the traffic engineers started talking to the emergency managers, and that was their big scare, was mountain shadows. And then they had it actually happen 6 years later. So. Thanks. So there's stuff you can do. 2000 Cerro Grande, switching gears now away from the neighborhoods and the traffic and stuff to the timing of all this stuff. Here's the big decision. When do we warn everybody? And this is a fire that had been burning for almost a week, set in Bandelier National Monument as a controlled burn. And here it is coming towards Los Alamos. You can see the golf courses. This is not exactly when they called the evacuation. It was controversial. They waited till the last minute. Political pressure from the lab to stay open. So there were still people at the lab when the evacuation warning went in. I think they were hoping it would veer away. But that turned out, that decision of when to tell people to leave is just got pretty fascinating. And so we got interested in warning triggers. So here's a trigger point. You can set this, and I'm sure there's people in the room that have done this. Choose a ridgeline or a road. And the idea is that when this fire, in this case, hits that trigger point, we tell those people to go. And so that's the textbook case. The things that mess this up. What if this is where the fire started? Now we have half the distance to set the trigger point. We also, when we set that trigger point, we have to think about how long it's going to take to get people out. And I've also made an assumption that we know what the community is. If you're in a rural area and there's a town, it's pretty easy to say, let's get Rohnert Park out, right? It's nicely well-defined. But if you're in San Diego County and it's just a sea of houses in the wooey, you have to draw that boundary yourself, stage the different areas, and it gets much more complicated than this. And then you can have the Oakland scenario where we just put that hazard right on top of the community. The fire ignition point was in the community, so in that case, the trigger is instantaneous. So I'll give you one example of how hard it can be to figure out how much lead time you have. So I forgot to mention one thing here, but essentially, the more, what I've noticed over the years is the more lead time there is, the better things go. It makes perfect sense, right? This process of warning people and getting them mobilized and the emergency managers deciding what they need to do takes time. So usually when you do see a problem like Oakland or the Tubbs fire or McMurray or a host of other fires, usually it's they didn't have enough time. They fell behind the curve. But what was Chief Bertulli chapped his lips, or things he had to get, he couldn't get ahead of the fire. So let's look at Yarnell. And I know this is a famous one for the firefighters, but I'm actually going to talk about the civilian side of things, the town of Yarnell Hill. So here's the scenario. We're trying to figure out if you're going to set a trigger point or not. 10 a.m. Sunday, lightning strike on the mountain. They issued a pre-evacuation notice. This is an Arizona issue, or an Arizona term. It would be the ready in the ready, set, go. There's a fire on the mountain. 11:19 a.m. evacuation notice for Model Creek and Double Bar A Ranch. Okay, so they're evacuating ranches that are out there, and you can see which direction they think this thing is heading. 1 p.m. in the afternoon. It's still heading towards Peoples Valley there in the distance. Firefighters report pre-evacuation trigger point reached for Yarnell. So they had a trigger point set. In Arizona, they set a 4-hour trigger point and a 1-hour trigger point. So this was the 4-hour one. At 2:02, the National Weather Service issues the first gusts and thunderstorm alert. 2:26, Yarnell is on 4-hour standby. So now they've moved to the set in ready, set, go. You may have to leave, and should have about 4 hours. 3 p.m. is still a Peoples Valley issue. We're going to evacuate Peoples Valley. Another National Weather Service thunderstorm alert. Mandatory evacuation for Peoples at 3:33. And then what's that? What happened there? The fire, I don't have the thunderstorm here above it, but it's suddenly taking off on the flank. And now we have mandatory evacuation for Peoples Valley and Yarnell at 4. They were told they have an hour. 4:15, they still have 45 minutes. Shrine trigger point reached. Firefighters pull back. 4:30, they still supposedly have another hour, and actually homes are starting to burn. So what happened? This fire, when they set the trigger point to give them an hour, actually was going 3 times as fast as they expected. So if it was going, let's say, assume it was going 1 mile an hour, it was going 3 miles an hour. So they only have 20 minutes. So people that were packing up their houses suddenly have their houses on fire as they're loading their cars. So this is the trigger point challenge. Fire won't just stay the same speed. It has to speed up, to change direction. So what is the lead time, and who is at risk? And you know, the complexities are unbelievable. Fire reaches Glen Ela at 4:30. It starts burning into Yarnell. That one right there is the one that hit the hot shots when it ran up that hill. Hot shot deployment. At 4:49, still 10 minutes or 11 minutes before they were supposed to get out, all of Glen Ela is on fire, filled with people. There were a lot of injuries. Unfortunately, there were no fatalities in the civilian group. And then look at 5 p.m. Look at that thing run. Whoa. Filled that whole canyon in the last 10 minutes. So just 2 kinds of things I wanted to point out was, one, the sort of structure of the communities that we're building, the lack of egress, the tangled roads. But even in some cases, as you've seen here in Sonoma, you can have 1 car all by itself, no traffic, no problem. But the timing issue, when were they warned? When was the fire coming? How much time do they have? That's on the trigger point side of things and the side of warning systems. A plug for in-place shelter. I don't think there's any shelter in that Oakland community I showed you. But if you do have a community like this, you know, there's the fire bunker. That's a really expensive thing, sort of the Cold War approach to fire. There's the Barona Casino. Shout out to Chief Cheney, if anybody knows Chief Cheney. He's the one in 2003 that told 300 people to stay in the casino during the Cedar Fire, and then parked his fire truck across the only exit. I always thought that would impress Tommy Lee Jones. I mean, that's a hero. Got to meet him. I'm very proud of that. So here's the community in Salt Lake City. Here's a home you could never shelter in Gamble Oak, but right across the street, there's a parking lot. You could park your SUV in there, get some protection. Back to Oakland, as Tower Power used to say, this was taken Sunday on my way up here. Those houses are close together, home ignition zones interlinked, vegetation coming back, lots of eucalyptus in the foreground, but they have kept the vegetation back somewhat. Evacuation context identical to 91. Not good. But, you know, $3 million homes. This is Charing Cross Road, where all the fatality, or most of the fatalities were. It looks like they've got some tarps there to kill anything that might be growing along that road, but you can see it's the same road. This is their community emergency preparedness memorial, and I found on one of these plaques, down in the corner, closely spaced houses in condominiums on narrow streets, one of the things that added to the danger. So still thinking about it. This didn't make me feel good. I wondered if this was put up after the fire. Has it really been that long? 27 years? Wow. So my conclusion, a resilient fire-prone community has a well-designed evacuation plan that considers likely scenarios and contingencies and conducts drills. It has a reliable warning alert system that's tested, and has viable protective backup plans when lead times are short, meaning in-place shelter and refuge options for Plan B. Thanks.
We've got some time for questions, and maybe Dave, you can come join us too, because we're moving into our discussion time period. Anyone ready to think about the big planning factor? Have we made progress here in Sonoma County in thinking about some of these issues?
They give an award for the most homes and the least numbers of access roads for planners.
Infamous trophy, I guess.
Just a question.
Oh.
Just a question. If
Yeah.
you could provide some follow-up materials or URLs for your type of information.
Well, my slides will be available
Right.
through the website of the symposium, and my talk will be taped. That does bring up another point, though, which is that another pet peeve is that evacuation planning is not required in the WUI, really. It's optional. And that's strange because it's required for buildings, and it's definitely required around a lot of facilities like nuclear power plants and chemical stockpile sites. But with the WUI, it's not exactly anybody's really fault, I don't think. So it's completely grassroots when it comes to emergency and evacuation planning activism. So it varies a lot. You can go from one community that can be incredibly prepared, another community that can be, what? We have wildfire risk? So.
Hi. You delineated the wildfire risks with your maps, and then you took a picture of Charing Cross Road and said, this is the spot. Is it possible to create maps that identify those choke points and create a communication with those communities?
Yeah, and that's kind of that first map I showed in Santa Barbara, where you can find the communities and there are few connections. So we were looking for bottlenecks. That's what that was, bottleneck analysis. So one road in, one road out is the ultimate bottleneck, but you can have 2 roads, 3 roads. So that is bottleneck analysis. One of the problems is they nest inside each other. Obviously, an evacuation of the entire Bay Area versus San Francisco. San Francisco is going to have 101 South, the Bay Bridge, and Golden Gate. You can get down inside that, and so the scale issue, fascinating for geographers, but what is the scale of the likely evacuation creates a problem in figuring out what the biggest bottlenecks are. At one point I did discover that California has an evacuation plan, left over from the Cold War. And so I'm in Utah, our house values would go up, but
So for your plan B on evacuations, or for your areas that you might have to take refuge, do you have some dimensions that you would suggest for planners?
Well, the first step is to look at what you already have, and that would be things like schools that are surrounded by a parking lot, or swimming pools, golf courses. Golf courses were used in, I think, the 2003 fires. You can turn on the sprinklers and have everybody park on the golf course in their car. Just rows and rows of cars. There's a very famous one in Marysville, Victoria, during the 2009 fires, where they used an oval, which I didn't know what it is. It's a cricket field, and they had everybody get out in the middle of the cricket field. It just looks like a grass lot. So there's safety zones and accidental safety zones and accidental shelter everywhere. But it does. Some communities go so far as to construct these things. But there's basically, the homeowner has their own, what's the best shelter you can come up with on your property in case you can't get off. Then there's the community ones, a short trip to some refuge site, like a safety zone. And then the next best thing would be getting out. But it's just, this is another issue that really hasn't been treated in any systematic way. What shelter do these various communities have available to them? It's something that firefighters do really well. I mean, they are extremely good at this. But what about cases where they can't get everybody out and they have to do that with residents? That's less studied.
Any advice about situations where, I know in our community we're trying to think about, well, what's our evacuation scenarios, but the uncertainty in terms of where's the fire going to come from, which way is it going to go, it's kind of stymied us in terms of trying to say, okay, this is going to be our plan. Also, I know we had a situation in the Valley Fire where at some point they had everyone's evacuating south along one highway, and then it got cut off, and they had to literally, you had the sheriff kind of racing along the meridian to get ahead of the evacuation to turn everybody around. So how do you deal with in terms of planning circumstance, how do you begin to comprehend that?
Well, in coming up with scenarios, there are some that fit really well. Like a couple speakers showed this similarity between the Hadley fire and the Tubbs fire. So if you, even before the Tubbs fire, looking at the Hadley fire and seeing, you know, how would that work? And then the other case is where you have the Valley Fire. Not sure there's a analog for the Valley Fire. I don't, you know, some of these fires are unprecedented surprises, but some of them match older fires. I know for a fact in Los Alamos that the emergency manager there was told that their most likely fire would be exactly the one they got from the southwest in June, coming from the Bandelier National Monument. So they actually had planned for that particular scenario. But there's a huge amount of knowledge among the speakers that we've seen in terms of past fire histories. And, you know, someone, I think it was Alex, mapped all the fires in California for the last 100 years. So there's a lot of scenarios out there that will repeat themselves, only with a lot more development.